real world performance is that it wasn't really a fair fight because I was actually upstairs, and these benchmarks you're looking at, these benchmarks are actually are from when the computer was right next to the router, and right now the computer is right next to the router. So now we've actually got a fair fight, and so what we're actually looking to compare is this one here is the SSD, and this one here is actually the RAID 1 enclosure right now. So you can actually see right now that the RAID 1 enclosure is it's having some activity with the LEDs. So we know that it's currently being accessed over the network. And we can also bring up the task manager, and we can actually see that the task manager is actually, you can see that the crystal disk is actually using the network, and you can kind of get an idea. And oh, there we go. We got 5.8. It's still quite a bit worse than having the SSD. That's actually not very good, Josh. Yeah. Not good. So what we're seeing right now is when you're using this over the network, you actually get pretty bad performance. You're getting 5.8 megabytes per second. Now, if you had an SSD over Wi-Fi, you could be getting 70 megabytes per second, which is approximately more than 10 times faster than the RAID enclosure, which is quite unusual because if you look at the raw performance, the SSD is about triple the performance of the hard drives. So it's kind of unusual that over Wi-Fi you get about 10 times better performance. Now that might have something to do with the numbers down here where you see that the multi-threaded deep quays, the SSDs are about 100 times faster there. So what we're seeing is, it might be worth it to have an SSD as your media server, but as we all know, SSDs cost a lot of money.
Yep.
So
a lot of money.
Up to you whether you want to go with the RAID enclosure or if you want to go with the SSDs. Now, to get the best of both worlds, you could plug your SSDs into the RAID enclosure.
Oh.
And unfortunately, I only have one SSD, so we can't do that test. Now, here's an interesting thing that we're seeing. It looks like the write performance is better than the read performance.
Ooh.
And it's kind of unusual. I can't really think of an explanation. Maybe one thing I would think is when you're writing over a Wi-Fi connection, you have fewer errors than when you read over a Wi-Fi connection, which it's the errors that keep the performance high. And again, we're seeing the write performance is higher for the other one. However, this is actually a bad thing because when you have a server, the read performance is more important than the write performance because a server is more often serving data and reading data than it is writing data.
That's true.
If you're going to use this as a media server, it will not have very good performance as you see the read. And I'll let this test go through just so you have an idea of how this RAID enclosure performs over. Well, let's look at the connections. You got USB-C on the back to USB 3.0A going into the router, and the router sends out the 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi into the laptop 5 gigahertz Wi-Fi, and this is the performance you get. So I'm going to snapshot this for my future use, and I'm going to name this as 5 gigahertz downstairs. 5 gigahertz downstairs. Now, the real test, my cameraman Josh is going to hold it, is, well, you might say, well, I'm not going to use it over Wi-Fi. I'm actually going to use my server over a wired connection. So what we have here is we have my computer doesn't have any Ethernet ports, so we actually got an Ethernet to USB adapter, and we're actually going to use this right now, plug into the laptop, and I'm actually going to turn off Wi-Fi. So if I go into here, boom. So I'm actually turned off Wi-Fi. The reason why I turned off Wi-Fi is so that I could kind of guarantee that it would not use Wi-Fi and that it would prioritize the Ethernet connection that's going on right here. So right now I'm going to test the Ethernet wired connection of this. So I'm gonna X out Crystal just to give it a fresh start, and I'm gonna select the media share folder again. I'm gonna run the test, and now right now we're actually running this exact same test, but this time we're running it over a wired Ethernet connection. And just to know that it's running, as you can actually see the hard drive LEDs are blinking, and you can also look at the Ethernet port, and you'll see that the Ethernet port is seeing activity as well. So you know that we're actually doing this test over a wired Ethernet connection. And let's see what kind of performance we get. Now this type of performance is what you're going to see if you've got your hard drive plugged into like a NAS sort of setup, or if you've basically this is a wired network connection as opposed to a wireless network connection. And we're actually seeing some pretty good performance here. We're seeing wow, 100 megabytes, and this is actually really good because this is actually close to the theoretical limit of Ethernet. So this is actually 1 gigabit Ethernet, and 1 gigabit Ethernet is equivalent to 120 megabytes per second. So we're actually close to the theoretical limit of Ethernet. So we've got a very efficient transfer here. And if you actually look at the SSD, you'll see that the SSD actually had even closer to the theoretical limit of 1 gigabit Ethernet. So, but one thing you'll notice is that the difference between the SSD and the RAID enclosure, they're almost the same. So if you've got a wired connection, it looks like the RAID enclosure is the way to go, because the SSD doesn't give you much benefit, at least with sequential reads.
True.
But if you look at the multi-threaded deep quays, 4.2 versus these numbers, it looks like you have a pretty big hit to performance there. And again, like I said, these random things, I don't know how reliable these three things are over the network, because like I said, I think the software might be messing up the timestamps. I think the most reliable indicator performance we have is actually the sequential performance. But I'm just going to let all the tests run through anyways, and we're seeing write performance is actually much lower, which is to be expected, I guess. Yeah, just given the fact that actually I can't really say why the write performance is so much lower than the read performance. This again might have something to do with just the drivers and the software. Trying to think of something smart to say, but I have no idea why the write performance is so much lower than the read performance. Well, it probably has to do with the file transfer protocol. Like sending data and receiving data probably used a different protocol. So one of those protocols was probably a lot more efficient than the other. So whenever you get into networking, you get into a lot of weird business because you just never know what protocol was being used. You don't know how much overhead there was. You don't know how many drop packets there were. You don't know how many times it had to resend or retry because of a drop packet. And there's a lot of complication with drivers and software and things like that. So your mileage may vary when you do your own test, and I'm just making this video to show you what kind of performance I got. And looks like this test is over. I don't know what you're gonna get with your test, but this is what I got.